The morning sun bathed the small town of Brookhaven in a golden glow, promising another uneventful day for its residents. For James Carter, a 35-year-old mechanic who had spent most of his life blending into the background, this particular morning was supposed to be no different. A man of few words and even fewer friends, James enjoyed the simplicity of his routine: work at the garage, dinner at home, and occasional jogs in the local park to clear his mind. Brookhaven was not the sort of town where extraordinary things happened, or so James thought. On this rare day off, James decided to lace up his worn sneakers and jog along the winding paths of Rosewood Park, a sprawling green oasis at the heart of Brookhaven. The park was peaceful, its serenity punctuated only by the rhythmic chirping of birds and the distant laughter of children playing on the swings. James liked it that way. It was a place where he could escape the noise of the world and the burden of being an outsider in a town where people like him, black men, were still quietly judged, even in the supposedly modern age. As he jogged past the towering oaks and neatly trimmed hedges, James allowed his mind to wander. He thought about his late mother, who had always told him to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Those words had guided him through the struggles of his youth, but lately, they felt like a distant echo. Life had become a series of quiet compromises, a survival tactic in a world that didn't always welcome him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, James noticed something unusual. A woman was jogging ahead of him, her bright pink athletic gear standing out against the earthy tones of the park. She was fit, focused, and moving at a steady pace. James thought nothing of it, until she stumbled. At first, it seemed like a minor misstep, but within seconds, her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the gravel path. Instinct took over. James sprinted toward her, his heart pounding not from exertion but from the sudden rush of adrenaline. As he knelt beside her, he could see that she was unconscious. Her face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on her forehead. James felt a pang of panic but forced himself to stay calm. He checked her pulse, weak but present. Years ago, during a stint as a volunteer firefighter, James had learned the basics of CPR. He never imagined he'd need to use those skills, but now they were all he had. "Hey! Can you hear me?" James called out, his voice urgent but steady. The woman didn't respond. Without wasting another second, he began chest compressions, silently counting each one. He glanced around, hoping someone else would come to help, but the park was eerily empty. After what felt like an eternity, the woman let out a faint gasp. James stopped the compressions and placed her in the recovery position, ensuring her airway was clear. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. He realized she needed medical attention, and fast. Reaching into his pocket, James pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "This is James Carter. I'm at Rosewood Park. A woman collapsed while jogging. She's breathing but unconscious. Please send an ambulance." The operator assured him that help was on the way. James stayed by the woman's side, speaking softly to her in case she could hear him. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice more confident than he felt. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens broke the park's silence. An ambulance pulled up, followed closely by a police cruiser. The paramedics rushed to the woman, checking her vitals and preparing to transport her to the hospital. James stepped back, his job seemingly done. But as he turned to leave, a police officer approached him. "Excuse me, sir. Can I have a word?" the officer said, his tone polite but firm. James nodded, assuming it was standard procedure. "Of course. I was jogging when I saw her collapse. I performed CPR and called 911. The officer's expression didn't change. "Did you notice anything unusual before she collapsed? Anyone else around?" James shook his head. "No, it was just her. I didn't see anyone else." As the officer took notes, a second officer approached with a concerned look. "We've got a problem," he said, holding up an empty running belt. Her phone and wallet are missing. James felt a chill run down his spine. He knew where this was going. "I didn't take anything," he said, his voice calm but tinged with frustration. The first officer raised an eyebrow. "No one's accusing you, sir. We're just trying to piece together what happened." But James could see the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken suspicion that hung in the air. He wanted to walk away, to let them sort it out, but he knew that leaving now would only make things worse. As the paramedics loaded the woman into the ambulance, words, "Do the right thing, even when it's hard." He had done the right thing, hadn't he? The officers eventually let him go, but not without warning him to stay in town in case they had more questions. James walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He didn't regret helping the woman, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now caught in something much bigger than himself. As he left the park, James noticed a man in a hoodie lurking near the edge of the woods. Their eyes met for a brief moment. A small crowd began to gather. Word traveled fast in Brookhaven, and soon, whispers filled the park. "Is that James Carter?" one woman muttered to her friend. "What's he doing here?" "Looks suspicious to me," another man chimed in. James stood his ground, trying to ignore the stares and murmurs. He thought about his mother's words, "Do the right thing, even when it's hard." He had done the right thing, hadn't he? The officers eventually let him go, but not the following day. Brookhaven buzzed with rumors about what had happened at Rosewood Park. Stories swirled among the locals, each retelling more distorted than the last. By the time James Carter arrived at his small mechanic shop on the edge of town, he could feel the weight of the town's collective gaze on him. It wasn't unusual for him to feel out of place, but today, the stares seemed sharper, the whispers louder. James busied himself with a car that needed its brakes replaced, trying to focus on the rhythmic work of loosening bolts and checking parts. He didn't want to think about the previous day, but the events clung to him like an unwelcome shadow. Every time he looked up, he imagined people peering through the garage windows, judging him for something he hadn't done. Meanwhile, across town, Emily Davis lay in a hospital bed, her memory hazy but her gratitude solid. She remembered very little about what had happened at the park, just fragmented images of running, a sharp pain, and then darkness. But she did remember waking up to a man's voice, steady, calming, reassuring. She couldn't picture his face, but she knew he had saved her life. As Emily recovered, the police visited her to gather information about the incident. They explained that her belongings were missing and that James Carter, the man who had helped her, was now under scrutiny. Emily frowned at the implication, her instincts telling her there was more to the story. "I don't know what happened to my phone or wallet," Emily said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "But I do know he saved me. That's the only thing I'm certain of." Back at the garage, James was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He looked up to see two police officers standing in the doorway. One of them, Officer Grant, was a familiar face in town. The other, Officer Riley, was newer, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," Officer Grant began, his tone carefully neutral. "We'd like to ask you a few more questions about what happened yesterday," without warning him to stay in town in case they had more questions. James walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He didn't regret helping the woman, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now caught in something much bigger than himself. As he left the park, James noticed a man in a hoodie lurking near the edge of the woods. Their eyes met for a brief moment before the man turned and disappeared into the trees. James hesitated, wondering if he should say something, but decided against it. He had already done enough, or so he thought. The day wasn't over, and James had no idea that this was only the beginning of a storm that would change his life forever. James wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Sure, but I already told you everything I know." Officer Riley stepped forward, holding a notepad. "We understand that. But there are some inconsistencies we need to address." Witnesses claim they saw you near the jogging path before the incident, and we need to clarify your movements. James sighed, feeling the frustration build. I was jogging, same as always. I saw her collapse, I ran over, and I called 911. That's it. The officers exchanged a glance. And you didn't see anyone else around? No one suspicious? James hesitated, remembering the man in the hoodie he had seen after the incident. He debated whether to mention it. Would it help or just make things worse? After a moment, he decided to speak up. There was someone, he said slowly. A man in a hoodie. I saw him near the edge of the woods after the ambulance arrived. He didn't stick around. Officer Grant raised an eyebrow. Did you recognize him? James shook his head. No. But he didn't look like he belonged there. The officers took notes and left, but their questions lingered in James's mind. Had he done enough by mentioning the man? Or had he just painted a target on his back? Meanwhile, Emily's frustration grew as she pieced together the fragments of her memory. She decided to do some digging of her own. She asked her sister, who worked at a nearby coffee shop, to gather information from the locals. Word of the incident had spread quickly, and Emily wanted to hear what people were saying. Her sister reported back that opinions in town were divided. Some people praised James as a hero who had stepped up when no one else would. Others whispered that he had ulterior motives, their biases coloring their perceptions of him. Emily, are you sure about this guy? Her sister asked. You don't even know him. I don't need to know him, Emily replied. I just know he didn't deserve to be treated like this. Determined to find the truth, Emily asked the hospital staff if there were any surveillance cameras near the park. She learned that a small coffee shop near the jogging path had security cameras that might have captured what happened. While Emily worked to uncover the truth, James faced mounting pressure. Customers stopped bringing their cars to his garage, and friends he thought he could count on started avoiding him. Even his boss began to question whether it was worth keeping him employed, given the rumors swirling around town. You've got to clear your name, James, his boss said one afternoon, handing him a stack of unfinished invoices. This isn't just about you. It's about the business, too. James nodded but felt the sting of the words. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation, he was fighting for his livelihood. As the days passed, Emily managed to get her hands on the security footage. What she saw shocked her. The video showed James running to her aid, performing CPR, and calling 911. But in the background, a figure in a hoodie could be seen lurking near the edge of the path. Moments after James turned his attention to Emily, the figure crept closer and took something from her running belt. Emily felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that James was innocent, and anger that he had been treated as a suspect when he had only tried to help. She contacted the police and showed them the footage, demanding that they clear James's name. The officers reviewed the video and identified the man in the hoodie as someone with a history of petty theft. They brought him in for questioning, and under pressure, he confessed to taking Emily's phone and wallet. News of the confession spread quickly, but the damage had already been done. James had been dragged through the mud, and though he was cleared of any wrongdoing, the experience had left scars. When Emily was finally well enough to leave the hospital, she sought out James to apologize. She found him at the garage, working on an old truck. James, she said hesitantly, her voice breaking the silence. He looked up, his expression guarded. Emily, right? She nodded. I wanted to thank you. For saving me. And I'm sorry for everything you've been through because of it. James shrugged, his eyes returning to the truck. It's not your fault. People see what they want to see. But it's not right, Emily insisted. And I'm going to make sure people know the truth. James appreciated her determination, but he couldn't help wondering if it would make a difference. In Brookhaven, first impressions often stuck, and his had been tarnished beyond repair. As Emily left the garage, she felt a new resolve. She couldn't undo the past, but she could help James rebuild his future. What she didn't realize was that her actions would soon ignite a larger conversation in Brookhaven, one that would force the town to confront its own prejudices and assumptions. The story was far from over, and both James and Emily were about to find themselves at the center of a storm that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their town, themselves, and each other. As the days turned into weeks, the incident at Rosewood Park became the talk of Brookhaven. Everyone had an opinion, and the story evolved into a symbol of deeper issues that simmered beneath the surface of the seemingly tranquil town. For James Carter, life hadn't returned to normal. The garage where he worked was eerily quiet, with only a handful of customers willing to bring their cars in. Every trip to the grocery store or gas station was met with hushed whispers and sidelong glances. James tried to ignore it, focusing on his work and sticking to his routine. But the truth was, he couldn't escape the feeling that he had become a stranger in his own community. His once simple life had been upended by an act of kindness that, instead of earning him gratitude, had placed him under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Emily Davis had recovered enough to return to her life, though she found herself haunted by the injustice James had faced. She replayed the security footage over and over in her mind, unable to shake the image of the hooded figure stealing from her as James worked to save her life. She had shown the footage to the police, who arrested the thief and cleared James of any wrongdoing, but the damage to his reputation was proving harder to undo. Determined to make things right, Emily began speaking out. She wrote a post on her social media, detailing the incident and praising James for his heroism. Her account quickly gained traction, with people from all over town commenting and sharing their own perspectives. Some praised Emily for setting the record straight, while others clung to their doubts, unwilling to admit they had been wrong about James. The town's reaction was split. For every voice defending James, there was another questioning why he had been in the park that morning or suggesting he might have had ulterior motives. The comments stung Emily, but they only strengthened her resolve. One afternoon, Emily decided to visit the local community center, where a group of residents had gathered to discuss the incident and its implications. The meeting had been organized by a small but vocal group of activists who saw the situation as an opportunity to address the town's underlying issues of bias and prejudice. Emily hesitated at the door, unsure if she would be welcome. But as she stepped inside, she was met with warm smiles and nods of encouragement. Among the group was Mrs. Lawson, an elderly woman who had lived in Brookhaven her entire life and was known for her wisdom and fairness. "We're glad you're here, Emily," Mrs. Lawson said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "This isn't just about James. It's about all of us and the kind of town we want to be." The discussion was raw and emotional, with residents sharing their own experiences of feeling judged or excluded. James's story became a catalyst for deeper conversations, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about their community. As Emily listened, she realized how much she didn't know about the struggles faced by people like James. She thought about her own privilege, the ease with which she had always moved through life, and the assumptions she had taken for granted. Inspired by the meeting, Emily decided to take her advocacy a step further. She reached out to local journalists, inviting them to cover James's story and the broader issues it had exposed. She also contacted a non-profit organization that specialized in community building and racial reconciliation, hoping they could help Brookhaven heal and grow. James, however, was less enthusiastic about the attention. He appreciated Emily's efforts but felt uncomfortable being thrust into the spotlight. He had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, and now he found himself at the center of a storm he never asked for. "Emily, I'm not sure this is helping," James said one evening when she visited him at the garage. "I just want things to go back to the way they were." "But don't you see?" Emily replied, her voice filled with passion. "They can't go back to the way they were. This is bigger than you or me. It's about changing how people think, how they treat each other." James sighed, wiping his hands on a rag. "I get that. But I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who saw someone in trouble and tried to help." "And that's exactly why your story matters," Emily said. "Because it shows how wrong people were to doubt you. It shows how much work we still have to do." Reluctantly, James agreed to participate in a town hall meeting organized by the community center. The event was held in the high school auditorium, with hundreds of residents in attendance. The atmosphere was tense, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. As James took the stage, he felt his palms sweat and his heart race. Public speaking was not his forte, but he knew this was an opportunity to set the record straight. "I didn't ask for any of this," James began, his voice steady but low. "I was just in the right place at the right time. I saw someone who needed help, and I did what anyone should do. But instead of being thanked, I was questioned, judged, and treated like a suspect." The audience listened in silence as James recounted his experience, his words painting a vivid picture of the fear, frustration, and isolation he had felt. "I'm not here to ask for sympathy," he continued. "I just want people to think about how quick we are to judge. How easy it is to assume the worst about someone based on how they look or where they come from." When he finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. For the first time in weeks, James felt a glimmer of hope. The town hall marked a turning point for Brookhaven. Inspired by James's courage, more residents began to speak out, sharing their own stories of bias and misunderstanding. The non-profit organization Emily had contacted offered workshops and resources to help the town address its divisions and build a stronger, more inclusive community. Still, not everyone was ready to change. Some residents clung to their prejudices, refusing to acknowledge their role in what had happened. But for James and Emily, the progress they had made was enough to keep them going. As the weeks passed, the conversation sparked by the incident at Rosewood Park began to transform Brookhaven. People who had never spoken to each other before found common ground, and new friendships formed across divides that had once seemed insurmountable. For James, the journey was far from over. But with Emily by his side and the support of a growing number of allies, he felt ready to face whatever came next. His act of kindness had set something powerful in motion, and though it had come at a cost, he knew it had been worth it. In the weeks following the town hall meeting, the atmosphere in Brookhaven began to shift. The conversation sparked by James's story continued to ripple through the community, forcing people to re-evaluate their perceptions and biases. While some residents resisted the change, others embraced the opportunity to grow and learn, inspired by the bravery and resilience James had displayed. James, however, was still grappling with the aftermath of the incident. Though many people now saw him as a symbol of courage and integrity, the experience had left scars that weren't easy to heal. He couldn't forget the cold stares, the whispered accusations, and the feeling of being an outsider in the town he had called home his entire life. One evening, as he locked up the garage after another slow day, James heard a knock at the door. He turned to see a familiar face, Emily Davis. She stood there with a hesitant smile, holding a small tray of cupcakes. "I thought you might appreciate a little company," she said, stepping inside. "And maybe some sugar therapy." James chuckled softly, appreciating her gesture. They sat down in the corner of the garage, the faint smell of oil and grease surrounding them. Emily handed him a cupcake, and for a moment, they ate in comfortable silence. James shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "I've spent my whole life dealing with stuff like this. It's just louder now because everyone's watching." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we have to make sure people keep watching, for the right reasons. I'm not done telling your story, James. Not until everyone sees what kind of person you really are." James wasn't sure what to say. He appreciated Emily's determination, but he wasn't convinced that telling his story would make a difference. Still, he couldn't deny the impact her efforts had already made. In the days that followed, Emily worked tirelessly to shed light on the injustice James had faced. She wrote letters to local newspapers, shared her perspective in interviews, and even started a blog dedicated to highlighting acts of kindness and courage in Brookhaven. Her passion was infectious, and soon others joined her cause. One of those people was Mrs. Lawson, the elderly woman who had spoken at the community center. With her decades of experience and deep connections in the town, she became a mentor to Emily, guiding her efforts and helping her navigate the complexities of community organizing. Together, they launched a campaign called See the Whole Picture, aimed at challenging stereotypes and fostering understanding in Brookhaven. The campaign included workshops, storytelling events, and art projects that encouraged residents to share their experiences and connect with one another. James watched these developments with a mix of admiration and skepticism. He was proud of what Emily and Mrs. Lawson were accomplishing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his own role in the movement was more symbolic than substantive. He continued to work at the garage, keeping his head down and avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. But fate had other plans. One afternoon, as James was working on an old pickup truck, a young boy wandered into the garage. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with a mop of curly hair and a mischievous grin. "Are you James Carter?" the boy asked, his voice filled with curiosity. James wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Yeah. Who's asking?" The boy held out a piece of paper, neatly folded. "My mom said to give you this." James took the paper and unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read the note. It was from a woman named Clara Rodriguez, a teacher at the local middle school. She explained that her students had been following his story and wanted to meet him. She invited James to visit their classroom and share his experience. James hesitated. The idea of speaking in front of a group of kids made him nervous, but he couldn't deny the tug of responsibility he felt. If his story could inspire even one of them to see the world differently, wasn't it worth it? A week later, James found himself standing in front of a room full of eager faces. Clara introduced him, and the students listened intently as he recounted the events at Rosewood Park. He spoke honestly about his fears, his frustrations, and the lessons he had learned. When he finished, a girl in the front row raised her hand. "Mr. Carter, do you think people can really change?" James paused, considering her question carefully. "I think people can change if they want to. But it takes effort. It takes listening and understanding. And it takes courage to admit when you're wrong." The girl nodded, her expression thoughtful. James could see the wheels turning in her mind. Realized that this moment, this connection, was worth all the pain and struggle he had endured. As the weeks turned into months, the See the Whole Picture campaign gained momentum. The art projects created by residents were displayed in the town square, and the workshops became a regular event at the community center. Brookhaven began to feel like a different place, a place where people were willing to confront their biases and embrace their differences. For James, life gradually returned to a new kind of normal. The garage regained its clientele, and the stares and whispers faded. But something deeper had changed within him. He no longer saw himself as just a mechanic or a jogger who happened to be in the right place at the right time. He saw himself as part of something bigger, a movement that had the power to transform lives. Emily, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. Her blog gained a loyal following, and she became a vocal advocate for justice and equality in Brookhaven. She and James grew closer, their friendship built on a shared commitment to making their town a better place. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking Rosewood Park, Emily turned to James with a smile. "You know, if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here with you, talking about changing the world, I wouldn't have believed them." James chuckled. "Yeah, life's funny like that." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the trees. The park was quiet, the air filled with the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. "Do you think we've made a difference?" Emily asked softly. James looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I think we've started something. And sometimes, starting is the hardest part." As the stars began to appear in the sky, James and Emily knew that their journey was far from over. But they also knew that together, they had the strength to keep moving forward, one step, one story, one conversation at a time. "I don't know," James said slowly. "I'm not sure I want to stir things up again." Marcus nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it. But this isn't just about you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. If we take this case to court, we can expose the biases that led to your false accusations and push for real change." James hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on him. The idea of reliving the ordeal was daunting, but he couldn't ignore the truth in Marcus's words. He had been given a platform, however reluctantly, and he realized that he had a responsibility to use it. After a long pause, James sighed. "Okay. I'll hear you out." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and difficult conversations. Marcus and his team began digging into the details of James's case, uncovering patterns of systemic bias that extended far beyond his own experience. They found records of other residents who had been unfairly targeted or mistreated, their stories echoing James's in haunting ways. As news of the lawsuit spread, Brookhaven was thrust back into the spotlight. Some residents rallied behind James, applauding his courage and vowing to support him every step of the way. Others, however, were less enthusiastic, viewing the lawsuit as an unnecessary disruption to the town's fragile peace. Emily Davis, who had become one of James's closest allies, was unwavering in her support. She threw herself into raising awareness about the case, organizing fundraisers and community events to rally support. Her blog became a hub for discussions about justice and equality, drawing attention from far beyond Brookhaven. Despite the growing support, the journey was anything but easy. James faced intense scrutiny, both from the media and from those in the community who still harbored doubts about his intentions. He received anonymous letters filled with hateful messages, and his every move was dissected and analyzed. Through it all, James leaned on the people who had stood by him from the beginning. Emily, Mrs. Lawson, and even some of his co-workers at the garage became his pillars of strength, reminding him why he had chosen to fight in the first place. As the trial approached, tensions in Brookhaven reached a boiling point. The courthouse steps became a battleground for opposing viewpoints, with protesters holding signs that ranged from "Justice for James" to "Stop dividing our town." The once quiet streets buzzed with a mix of hope and unease, the air heavy with anticipation. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed with spectators. James sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Marcus stood beside him, radiating confidence as he prepared to present their case. The trial was a grueling process, filled with emotional testimony and heated arguments. Marcus meticulously laid out the evidence, painting a vivid picture of the systemic biases that had led to James's wrongful accusation. Witnesses shared their own experiences, their voices trembling with a mix of pain and determination. When it was James's turn to take the stand, he spoke from the heart, his words raw and unfiltered. He described the humiliation he had felt, the fear of being treated as a criminal despite his innocence, and the lasting impact the incident had on his life. "I'm not here to make enemies," James said, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure no one else has to go through what I did. We can't change the past, but we can change what happens next." As the trial drew to a close, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they finally returned with a verdict, the room fell silent. "We find in favor of the plaintiff," the foreperson announced. The court acknowledges the systemic failures that led to his wrongful treatment and orders restitution, along with mandatory reforms for law enforcement practices in Brookhaven. The room erupted in a mix of cheers and murmurs. James felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew the verdict was just the beginning. The changes that the court had ordered would take time and effort to implement, but they were a step in the right direction. In the weeks following the trial, Brookhaven began to rebuild once again. The reforms mandated by the court included new training programs for local law enforcement, community oversight committees, and initiatives to promote dialogue and understanding among residents. While not everyone embraced the changes, the town was undeniably moving forward. For James, the journey had been long and arduous, but it had also been transformative. He had started as an ordinary man who wanted nothing more than to do the right thing, and he had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Though he still preferred the quiet life of the garage, he had come to understand the power of his voice and the impact of his actions. One evening, as he stood in Rosewood Park, James reflected on how far he and the town had come. The park, once the site of his greatest trial, now felt like a place of renewal, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. Emily joined him, her expression thoughtful as she gazed at the sunset. "Do you think we did enough?" she asked softly. James smiled, his eyes steady. "We started something. And that's more than I ever thought we could do." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm golden glow, James and Emily knew that their work wasn't finished. But they also knew that together, they had sparked a movement that would continue to grow, lighting the way for others to follow. As the years passed, the story of James Carter and the town of Brookhaven became a legend, passed down through generations as a testament to the power of courage, unity, and compassion. James himself remained a humble presence in the community, always ready to lend a hand or share a word of wisdom. And though he never sought the spotlight, his legacy continued to inspire those around him. In the end, it wasn't just a story about a single moment or a single man. It was a story about the choices people make when faced with adversity, the strength that comes from standing together, and the belief that even the smallest actions can lead to profound change. And for James, that was more than enough.